Hello, everybody, and welcome to this brief webinar on share buybacks and the cynicism within the boardroom. I'm delighted to be joined this morning by Alan McFarlane, founding partner of Dundas Global Investors. Sort of just cutting to the chase, Alan. Share buybacks, is that a red flag for you?
It has been and remains so. So when we started the business in 2010, we really came across the extent of share buybacks, particularly in the USA, which had been uncommon in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, but have become much, much more common. To the point now that it's almost impossible to find a listed US company that does not get involved in share buybacks. And there's ways they can do it. Some of them use buybacks to neutralize shares they issue as options to colleagues. But the majority of share buybacks are systematic reductions in the amount of equity capital in a business. The company just goes in the market and buys its own shares and cancels them. So a business that starts the year with 100 shares in issue, buys back 3 of them, they end the year with 97 shares in issue. Now, why does that matter? Because if your profits are 200 and you have 100 shares in issue, earnings per share, $2. I'm just going to prove I'm not very mathematical. But if your earnings are 200 and you divide by 97, it's $2.01. So you can make earnings per share higher by having fewer shares. Now, that kind of financial engineering, we were very leery about it and quite hostile to it. We've had to come to accept it because the majority of the companies we invest in pay dividends and buy back their shares as well. So it is a red flag. And the reason it's a red flag, moving away from our immature reaction, is that as time has gone by, the biggest feature of the red flag is that the financial engineering is what drives the reported earnings per share growth. So that company grows its earnings, say it's 6% earnings per share growth, but that's because they've got 4% fewer shares. The business organic growth is only 2%. And the most pernicious bit of that is that chief executives and other senior officers in many US companies, the primary criterion to assess their eligibility for bonuses is growth in earnings per share. In other words, you give a CEO an incentive to generate earnings per share growth faster than his industry. Well, one way to do that is buy back shares faster than your competitors. So is that a perverse incentive? We've yet to see a company fail because of it, but it's brought financial engineering into the boardroom much more than I think you or I would want to be the case.
Just taking that a stage further then, can you give some examples how this may have kept you out of some trouble?
Yeah, the first one that we really came across that we looked askance at is IBM. Now, everybody watching this video under the age of 50 won't remember what IBM was. Everybody over that will remember it was the world's biggest technology company. So it defined the PC industry. So IBM was the one that when it finally decided to launch a PC, it bought its chips from Intel and its software from Microsoft. Microsoft got a monopoly, Intel a de facto monopoly. And so everybody else went and built PCs using Intel chips and Microsoft software, and that's built the industry. IBM set it and then left the industry because they weren't competitive in it. Their core business was things called mainframe computers, which ruled the world from the 50s through to the end of the 80s. But the growth of distributed computing, IBM didn't keep up. And so by the time we looked at it, it had given up being run by IBM salesmen or engineers. It was in the hands of ex-McKinsey consultants who saw the cash flow at IBM and realized that the quickest way to grow earnings per share was to develop a persistent, systematic policy of buying back its own shares. And so looking at the funds flow statement for IBM, cash is profit plus non-cash items like depreciation and others. You adjust for working capital, and the cash flow, where did they spend it? Didn't spend much on acquisitions, probably a good thing. Not much spent on capital expenditure, but 80% of their cash flow and more was going to buy back shares. And they were reducing their share count by 3% per annum. I think over the period when we looked at it, IBM's share count was down 45% over 10 years. So you've shrunk the denominator. So even if your profits were static, you look as if you're growing per share. So we just thought, you're not in the technology business. You're in the business of milking. You're just milking a cow every morning for a pail of milk. And interestingly, around that time, Warren Buffett got involved in it. I don't think he did. I think some of his colleagues did, because they thought it was a mature business, like some of the insurance and railroad businesses they had. What they didn't understand was that Amazon Web Services and Azure and others were really eating into IBM's core market. And so we've never owned an IBM share. Now, it has changed, and they've got rid of the financial engineers and they've put IT people in charge. So we'll look again. But that studying the cash flow statement, looking at how much went on share buybacks and realizing that financial engineering was IBM's business. The business was not selling machines. The business was massaging the earnings per share. And we stayed out, and that was the right thing to do.
Yeah. So taking that forward on a day-to-day basis, when you sift companies, how do you apply that, and how do you live by that? I mean, I take it you don't not necessarily invest in businesses that do share buybacks.
Well, we can't avoid them. I mean, it's still pervasive in the USA, and it's beginning to be in some countries outside the USA. So given a free hand, it would be great that all companies kept a static share count, like a benchmark in a laboratory, and things could be measured against it. But that's gone. It may return, but it's gone. So what we look at is, as with the IBM discussion, we look at how is the cash generated? What does the company do with that cash? So does it make acquisitions to grow its business? Does it invest in capital expenditure to expand its activities? And what we're looking for are companies for whom the first call on the cash they generate is to reinvest and grow the business. So they're planting, if you'll pardon the pun, they're planting seed potatoes and carrots and so on for future crops. That's what we're looking for. And who distribute a minority of their cash flow to shareholders. Now, we prefer that dividends are the dominant feature of that. In some cases they are, some not. But some companies just generate so much cash, and that they don't want to grow the dividend at 30–40% per annum and then have to cut it. So they try and put it on a stable path that they think is related to the growth of their businesses. And some still have cash after that. So the ones that are in that position and buy back shares, happy days. We like that. That's good. And it's a balance of capital management that balances the cash generated, the reinvestment necessary to grow the business, the stability of the dividend to the shareholders. And so for those businesses, share buybacks tend to be quite volatile. In the good years, they'll buy back. And for example, in COVID and others, many companies suspended them. So that's how it works. Now, if you put that into flesh and blood, Microsoft. So Microsoft's just had a great 4-year run. Revenues are growing at above 12% per annum. This is for a business that was hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue at the beginning of that period. And it's been putting on $23 billion a year revenue because it got linked in, because of the revival of the change in Office 365, because of the development of Azure, Microsoft Web Services, because of the internationalization of their business. So Microsoft has become a really dominant player in business and commercial computing at the individual level. It's just better now. IBM's cash flow statement is largely what I just described. And they keep the dividend growth back to, from memory, I probably get this wrong, but say 10% per annum. But they use buybacks, and their share count's drifting down by 1.5% per annum. So when IBM says earnings per share grew 14%, a tenth of that comes from buybacks. When IBM said our earnings per share were up 7%, 80% of that came from buybacks. So one's an engineer of money, the other one's a software engineer growing its business and deploying excess cash sanely.
That's fantastic. I think that's all from us. And thanks for your time, Alan.